So welcome, everybody. Very excited to have such a great group of people coming out today for this. So my name is James Shepard. I'm the CEO and founder of AchieveMission. AchieveMission works to dramatically increase the impact achieved by nonprofits and the social sector by enhancing the sector's perception and practice of human capital management. That's all a mouthful, but hopefully by the end of today you'll understand what it all means. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that's going to focus on the social ROI of investments in those areas. And I'd like to thank, of course, Blue Avocado and the Nonprofits Insurance Alliance Group for their help in organizing and hosting today's webinar. And I'd like to thank our speakers, introduce them quickly. Rich Berlin is the Executive Director of Harlem RBI, and Christa Roth is the Senior Director of Talent for Build. Thank you both for coming and joining us today. Both Harlem RBI and Build are nationally recognized nonprofits. They're both undergoing rapid growth, and we at AchieveMission had the privilege of working with each of them as they made great strides to increase and strengthen their human capital management capabilities. I'd also like to thank, just briefly, some of our key funders, Annie, Casey, and Kresge, without whom this all wouldn't be possible. So let's talk about what we're going to try to get done today. So first I want to do is just make sure we're on the same page about what is human capital management and why calculate the investment ROI. Then we're going to have Christa walk us through an example at Build of some of the calculations they've done on an ROI basis. We'll look at a couple of different approaches to calculating return on investment in human capital management. Rich will walk us through, again, some of the calculations and viewpoints that he as a CEO brings to this discussion. And then at the end, hopefully, we'll save at least 15 or 20 minutes for your questions. And I just want to echo something I said earlier, which is if you have questions, please send them in at any time. We'll be pausing throughout. If there are questions that are clarifying questions, we're going to try to take those right on the spot so we don't leave them hanging because they won't make a lot of sense when we get to the end. Some of those questions we'll leave to the end if we think that that's a better place to catch them, but feel free to weigh in. So let's talk about what is human capital management. So before we get to that, there are 4 trends that are really making human capital management a hotter topic in discussion today, and I think that's evident by the fact that we had, I don't know, almost 300 people register for today's webinar. So one is there's been this dramatic shift in the economy. Back in 1980, if you look at this chart, the majority of an organization's assets, and this is mostly looking in the corporate sector, but it has some relevance to the nonprofit sector as well. Most of the assets in an organization were tangible assets. That's factories and equipment and land. By 2010, there's been a sea change, and now we're looking at the majority of an organization's assets are intangible. And what that really means is, in a sense, a large majority of an organization's assets are the people in the organization, the skills, the know-how, the relationships that they bring to your organization. What that means is there's a corresponding shift, whereas before they might be saying, how do I make sure I get the best factory and equipment, et cetera, in the corporate sector. Now we're looking at how do we make sure we have the right people with the right capabilities, because that's the asset that we need to most pay attention to. The second thing, trend that's been going on, and I'm sure many of us have read about the leadership crisis. Compass Point has done some good work. Bridgespan wrote a report a couple of years ago. This is bringing increased emphasis on trying to understand what are the practices within an organization that we can build that will allow that organization to build the leadership team and the capabilities it needs. Third is a real shift towards accountability and outcomes in the nonprofit sector. So with that comes a corresponding shift in many cases in how we want to manage people. We want to manage them to be accountable. We want to manage them to outcomes. And we don't necessarily have all the processes in place to do that. And so human capital management offers a solution to some of the problems that come with that shift. And the last trend that I think really is bringing renewed attention to this issue is growth funding. Whether that's coming from venture philanthropy or it's coming from some of the government programs like Raise to the Top and Social Innovation Fund, you're seeing a noticeable number of organizations, and I will point to Build and Harlem RBI as examples of this, that are undergoing very rapid growth, even during this period of economic uncertainty. And with that comes the realization at any given time as they look ahead that the team that they have is not the team that they're going to need to have 3 years from now or 2 years from now if they're going to stay on course. And that means that they need to understand, how do I bring people on board? How do I hire them? How do I manage them? How do I build an organization to support them? So these 4 trends are bringing renewed attention to this topic. So let's talk, what is human capital management? So difficult concept. So first of all, human capital management is a series of processes for building and managing the leadership and team needed to help an organization achieve its strategy and make the social impact of its mission. Let that pause for a second. So really, I'm going to, I think hopefully a lot of you have dealt with logic models in your organization in some way or other. This is very much akin to a logic model. One can look at human capital management processes and look at what are the inputs we're putting into strengthening them. We're putting in expertise, we're putting in money, we're putting in staff time. One of the things we're going to do is build and implement new human capital management capabilities. As one example, and we'll go through some more in a second, that will lead to improved talent acquisition capabilities, which hopefully will lead in this middle blue column to stronger leadership in the organization, which in turn leads to more mission impact per dollar. And when we talk about processes, we're really talking about 25 different processes in human capital management. So we bucket them into these 6 categories. A number of them have to do with the strategy of human capital management and the way that you use these pieces together to achieve your strategy, the way that you govern these functions. More traditional things that people might think about around talent acquisition, development and retention, ways to manage goals, coordinate information within an organization, and help you make sure you have a culture that supports the organization to be successful. So there are 3 reasons why people generally talk to us about why do I want to calculate the ROI of human capital management in my organization. So the biggest one is to secure resources. So what that means is an organization, somebody comes to us and says, hi, I believe in human capital management. I believe we need to invest in it, but I have a board member or a funder or a CEO, and I need to demonstrate to them that making these investments is going to improve our organization and that we can afford it. The second is to help an organization prioritize. There are a lot of different kinds of investments one can make within human capital management. Which one is most important? And the third reason people talk to us is typically so they can set up systems to measure and improve the systems that they have. We can't cover all of this today, so we're going to be focusing on this first one. So really my goal, or our goal at the end of this day, in this presentation, is to arm you with resources that will allow you to talk to a decision maker in your organization and convince them that these kinds of investments make sense and will improve your organization's ability to achieve mission impact and will ultimately cost you less money. Both of those things are important. So before we move on to build, I just want to check, Irene, and see if anybody is asking questions that we should pause for.
We just had a question about the processes. I think there were some examples there, and someone wanted to know whether talent development and retention also fit in and how those fit in.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go back a couple of slides here if I can. And what you see here is talent acquisition, talent development, and talent retention. So all of those are definitely part of these processes, and we'll expand on that in another slide, I guess. Okay. So I'm going to move on and turn the speaking role over to Christa, who will walk us through a little bit of the calculations at Build and the great work that they've done in talent and human capital management.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to share the story of Build with you and many of the lessons that we learned through our first regional expansion. It was sort of 2005, 2006, we were experiencing some really strong program results in the Bay Area, and a lot of our national funders and people were coming to us sort of saying, would you consider expanding? and we wanted to expand the program beyond. So we chose Washington, D.C. And in choosing to expand beyond the Bay Area, it really shifted us back to more of a startup mode because we had to retool a lot of our systems and structures. So in expanding, the national office invested about $600,000 in subsidizing the D.C. office, which was not yet financially self-sustainable at all, and we, as seed capital. And what we did was we had one of our staff members go over to Washington, D.C. and lead the program. In those first couple years, we had some really rough times. We only were able to raise about 25% of our revenue from local sources. We had one of the highest per student cost of any of our sites in a startup mode. And we had really hard retention because we didn't have the right school partners and the right understanding of the DC school system to be able to do this work well. We also lacked some of the operational capacity to support a remote site. So we were faced with all the typical challenges of a startup mode and a startup site. So if we go to the next. So after 2 years, we decided to undertake it again, and we opened up our Boston site. But we took a lot of the lessons that we learned, and during that time, we participated in the talent initiative, and we hired Senior Director of Talent myself, and we really created the Regional Executive Director role. So understanding that we needed to put leadership on the ground in Boston that understood the Boston community. And we also invested much earlier on in setting up the advisory board, and we recruited somebody, and we recruited a really strong board leaders who then worked on developing out the advisory board on our behalf. In the meantime, we also began to identify what were the competencies that we needed each of our roles to play, particularly in a startup role. So we hired 2 staff members, and we hired very senior people in those positions in Boston, something we hadn't done in D.C. And as a result, we had much stronger outputs in our program. We were able to get almost 100% of our funding done from local sources, partially because our executive director had run an organization in Boston for a long time. She was familiar with both the Boston schools and the Boston funding community and was a known commodity there. That was all learned through our process of really looking at our human capital. Unlike in D.C., where we really struggled to get the right school partners, in Boston we had 14 schools apply to launch for our four school partners, and they were deeply invested because of the competitive nature of it. They really deeply invested in that first year in the program's success and were true partners. And we didn't just house the program on their school campus. We really were partners with them. And as a result, we had an 87% first-year school retention. That's up from 20% in D.C., a dramatic difference. We had our school costs, because of the kind of retention we had, came down to $5,000 per student. That's almost $2,500, almost $3,000 less than D.C. And again, I reiterate how important it was that we really were embraced by the Boston funding community, and 100% of our funds are locally raised in Boston today and going forward. And so what's interesting is through our investment in human capital, we actually saved money, a tremendous amount of money. And it has cost us money in D.C. by not doing the same kinds of investments, because we are still, in D.C., we are still building that local funding community. We are still transitioning to new school partners that are stronger. So all of that investment actually created better program results. So that's pretty much the Build story. Are there any questions?
There's a question about, you mentioned some of the immediate impacts in Boston of focusing on human capital management. Can you tell us about some of the longer-term impact?
Absolutely. I think the longer-term impact are that we have a brand awareness and we have a brand of excellence and true partnership. We understood who to recruit on our advisory board, so they have really, we've got university partners, we've got partners from the Boston School District. All of those have long-term impact in terms of our ability to create true partnerships and presence in the community. Our student retention numbers and our student engagement is much higher because we've really got true school partners and we've really recruited the right students into the program who can really succeed. We're going into our second year in Boston, and it's the same size as DC after 5 years. So we really feel like the early investments have led to a robust program that has a strong foundation, rather than in DC where we've had to like retool. We retooled our leadership, we retooled our board, we've retooled our school partners, and they're doing great now, but it took a lot. It took 5 years to get them to that place, whereas in Boston we've got them to that place in 18 months.
Great.
Great.
Thanks,
we have one more question that just came in. Someone wants to know, how directly can you correlate the improved results in Boston to human capital management versus other environmental factors?
I think it's a direct correlation. I think it has been much more self-sustaining and much more, I do think, and I'll just be honest, DC is a much harder place to raise money than Boston. We all know that. It's not a mystery. But the kind of lessons we learned in DC that we were able to apply early on. So for example, one of the things that we learned is we had to put people on the ground much sooner than we did in Boston. That was something we had to convince our board that we needed to pay up front 10 months before the program year started. We had to start bringing on program people to be able to build those kinds of partnerships with schools. And so all we had on the ground in that first year was human capital. So the results of the first year are absolutely tied to the strength of the board in fundraising and the strength of the program staff in the program results, because we literally launched, and as we were talking about, that all we had was intangible resources on the ground of human capital. We had an office that wasn't even ours. We were in a couple offices in Mintz Capital, Mintz 11. So not much except a curriculum, a program model, and people that really committed to executing at a high level.
Thanks, Christa. Great stuff. And we'll have more time at the end for more questions if people have other additional questions. So let's walk through a little bit about how to calculate ROI. There are a couple of different approaches, and ours is really going to flow from the goal we set earlier, which is to help folks convince others to make human capital management investments. So in this approach, what we're going to do is looking really at studies. Looking at studies that show these kinds of investments, those kinds of investments that you're trying to make, are producing high returns on investment elsewhere. The challenge I think we all have in the nonprofit sector is that almost all the studies that exist out there so far, or most of the big ones and best ones, are really the corporate and public sector. Although you can kind of tell from some of the work we've done with Christa, and you'll hear later from Rich, we're beginning to try to make inroads in those areas. So today we're going to really look at two different levels of detail in those kinds of studies. So one group of studies are looking at human capital management investment en masse without regard to which kind of investment an organization is making, and trying to correlate the strength in the human capital management capabilities in general to impact. The second kind of studies look more narrowly at either specific processes, so for example, talent acquisition, or they look at a specific medium-term result, a medium outcome, such as stronger leaders, and try to correlate one of those two pieces to impact at the end of the day. So let's walk through those. Before we do that, I need to put this concept on the table for everybody. This is a human capital management maturity level approach. This one happens to be, as you'll see in the note in the bottom left, from Josh Burson Associates. And what you see here is a way of categorizing the human capital management capabilities of an organization. An organization that is at the lowest level, at the level 1 capability level, is really characterized by being able to hire and pay, and if necessary, get rid of people in a way that is legal. It's really about compliance. There's no effort or no capability within the organization to do anything beyond just those bare legal minimums. And if we raise all the way up to the top to level 4, there we're talking about a human, an HR, human capital management capability that with a strategy of human capital management is an integral and essential piece of the organization's strategy. They're really inextricably entwined together, where human capital management, or HR in this slide, is really helping to drive decisions and is driving data, is helping to improve results, and we're really finding that it's an integral part of the organization through and through. And then obviously levels 2 and 3 are intermediary levels that organizations typically go through as they invest and move up from level 1 to level 2 to level 3 to level 4. And this particular model, like I said, is from Burson. There are similar models. The General Accounting Office, the GAO, has a model. David LaPiana, a colleague of mine next door in the East Bay Area, has a model. A couple different models. They all are fundamentally the same. Some of them are 4 points. This one is a 4.1. The GAO is 4 points. David LaPiana's is 3. McBassey's happens to be over a 100-point scale. But they all fundamentally have much more in common than they have that are different. So keeping that concept in mind, what we're going to do is look at a couple of studies, but they're all going to have this general form. So I want to introduce the form first. What you have here on the horizontal axis is the human capital management maturity level that we were just discussing, and we're seeing here a range from low in the bottom left to high in the bottom right. On the vertical axis, we're showing social impact or business results, again, low to high. And the intent is to be able to show in these studies that the hypotheses that they were testing is as you make investments in human capital management capabilities and build the human capital management maturity level of an organization, does that lead to improving the social impact or the business results of the organization? So let's look at this first study. This is a great one because it happens to be done in a school system, and that has a closer correlation for all of us that are in the nonprofit sector to the kinds of worlds that we live in. So again, on the bottom, we have the human capital management maturity level. In this case, it's a -20 to +20 scale, but it's the same fundamental concept. And on the vertical axis, we're looking at the average change in mean math scores. And what you're looking at here, each one of these dots represents a different school. What they've done in this study is said, let's look at schools and see, how do we characterize their human capital management maturity level? Do they fit, if we simplify back to that Burson model, to level 1 to 4? What does it look like? And what's the school's rate of improving math scores over time? And then you put each one of these dots on the table, the graph, and you do the regression. And this is the line you get, which shows pretty strongly that in organizations that have invested and made a decision to improve their human capital management capabilities, those schools on average achieve better academic results. What's interesting about this one is it kind of shortchanges the question of cause and effect, which often is raised. We'll talk about that in a second, because each one of these schools really didn't get more money because they got better. So we'll return to that thought in a second. Anyway, very strong correlation, really makes the case. The second one we're going to look at here is another study that looked at, this is a Bersin study looking at human capital management maturity levels, again, back to that level 1 to 4 scale, and correlating that to revenue per employee. And so what we see here is, as an organization matures its human capital management capabilities over time, what you're seeing is an increase in the revenue per employee from $100,000 per employee at level 1 all the way up to $270,000 for level 4. This third study is the most far-reaching, I think, for all of us in the nonprofit sector to correlate to ourselves, but hopefully for board members or others, it will bear more fruit. And what this shows is for a bunch of financial institutions, the human capital management maturity level on the bottom again, and in this case, total stock return on the vertical axis, again, showing that organizations that had made the decision to improve and strengthen human capital management produced much higher stock returns to their investors. So that's 3 studies. This is a lot more studies, each one of which, in a sense, would end up with exactly the same chart, exactly the same graph, showing that investments in human capital management produce significantly stronger results. And don't feel a need to copy this all down. If you want this information, we're going to later tell you how to get a hold of the deck, so you can just do that much more easily. So I just want to pause for half a second here and just take a stock where we are. What we've just shown through a dozen studies is that investment in the stronger human capital management processes on the left lead inextricably to stronger strategy and impact. And I think the thing that is important to note here is it's not just better results, it's better results at less money. It's better financial results in total. It represents a way to save money, as you heard from Christa, both get better results and save money in aggregate over time. You're shifting resources in the way that you're investing in the organization, not necessarily having to add additional funding over that multi-year period. So before we go on, again, I just want to pause for half a second, make sure everybody's following. Any questions for us, Harini?
Yeah, one question is, you use a lot of corporate and public sector examples here, and how can you draw the conclusion that this will work in nonprofits?
It's a great question. So I think that there are a couple of ways of looking at that. So one is that this model has worked in a range of different settings. So it's worked in different corporate settings, large, small, different organizational types, different industries, et cetera. It's worked in hospitals, many of which have been nonprofits, although larger than many of the organizations on this call. It's worked in the military. So it's worked in a wide variety of institutional types, and it really, I think, strengthens the case that nonprofits should see similar results. The second argument I guess I would make is we have seen other management best practices, like, for example, strategic planning, make the journey from the corporate sector and the government sector into nonprofits. And each one of those trips has required us in the nonprofit sector to make excuse me, important adaptations, but the fundamental pieces, whether it's Jim Collins or others, have found ways to produce great results. And I guess, maybe I'm making an assumption about why you're asking, but what I've seen consistently is people on boards or foundations where there are people that are skeptics of this. And I think what's important to recognize is in picking your fights, I guess. We're at the beginning of what I would consider to be a decade or 15-year transition of having these kinds of best practices become an integral part of what makes the nonprofit sector tick. just like logic models and evaluation and outcomes have made that transition over the last, say, 10, 15 years. If you're an organization that's a risk taker and likes to be on the cutting edge and is willing to and wants to be part of making this happen, and I would point to both RBI and Build as examples of that, you're likely to find people in your organization that make the leap and see these things as a good fit. And if you're an organization that's a little bit more skeptical, that's okay. There's going to be a lot of organizations that want to wait and see the Builds and the Harlem RBIs amass the data to show and to build the studies to show that this works in the nonprofit sector. And you just need to decide which kind of an organization you're at and push accordingly. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So, what we just did a second ago was look at ROI of investments in human capital management in general. What I want to do now is shrink down from looking at all of these processes in aggregate without focusing on one in particular to focusing on just one. And in this case, just based on one of the studies I really liked, we're going to look at talent acquisition. And as you see at the bottom, we're pulling some of this data from Watson Wyatt and from the Boston Consulting Group that's done some interesting work. And in those studies, what they've shown is that investments improving talent acquisition capabilities produce some immediate results. And these are the kind of immediate operational output results that we're familiar with from logic models that are early indicators, but hopefully of success. In this case, I'm going to point to three. One is investments led to shrinking the time it takes to fill a job from 7 weeks to 2 weeks. Offer acceptance ratio climbing from 40 to 100%. That's huge because that really means is that instead of having, if you at 40%, it means on average your first 2 candidates that you make an offer to are not accepting. That's pretty tough. It means you're accepting your second or third best candidate for the job. If you're 100%, it means you're getting your best candidate for the job. We're also seeing big increases in employee referrals, which, as you may know, the quality of candidates coming in from employee referrals is much higher. So by strengthening your ability to activate that network, you're really increasing your odds of finding great people. These are all, again, output kind of metrics. Going over to the right side, what they saw also is that those kinds of outputs led, in turn, to the kind of impact that, again, given that this is a corporate study, that they were really looking for. So 3 to 5 times higher total return to shareholders, which is dramatic, just huge given the modest kind of investment it takes to make talent acquisition stronger, and 3 to 5 times higher revenue growth, again, just a huge impact from a relatively modest investment. So that's talent acquisition and looking at a particular process. And there are other studies that look at investments in these other kinds of areas and draw this kind of correlation. So if you're talking to a board member or a CEO or whomever and trying to make the case that you should invest in human capital management, it may be that it's better to make the case, as we did a minute ago, looking at investments in aggregate, or it may be better to find studies that really focus on the particular areas that you're looking to make investments in, such as, in this case, talent acquisition. There's another way of slicing the data. In this case, excuse me, we're looking at a pool of materials and resources, asking the question of if we can improve the quality of our leadership, what will the impact be? And this study looked at the question of what's the impact of having a great principal in a school? What impact does that make on students' academic achievement? And I've simplified the study because it goes into a lot more rich detail, but in this particular data set, we're just going to look at principal that's among the top 10%, so the 90th percentile. How does that principal compare in terms of the academic achievement achieved at its school compared to an average principal? And the result is stunning. So great principals are able to achieve in their schools 25% higher growth rates in student academic achievement. Just to put that in perspective, that means if your kids are in school, first grade to 8th grade, in a school that has a great principal as compared to an average principal, they're going to learn 2 additional years of content just from having a better principal. And that's just an average, let alone going all the way to the other end of the spectrum and looking at weak principles. So really dramatic thing. And if you think about the cost of improving student academic achievement through other mechanisms and look at the cost of getting great principles as opposed to average principles, you begin to see that there's a really strong ROI case to be made. Now, whether you can extract this and make the case, as Christa did a minute ago, for example, that by getting a great leader in a new regional city is going to make the difference, a huge difference in the outcome of that city as compared to another growth city. Similar kind of study or impact that you're looking for. So I'm just going to show you this slide, which again, there's no way you can read this, and I've broken every rule there is to make about drawing good slides here. What we're showing here is just some small number, and I really do mean small number, of the metrics that one can look at each one of these levels. So the process level, really looking at mechanics, percentage of job offers accepted, the percentage of staff that are hiring well after they've been hired, people that have individual development plans. These are all kind of mechanical things that one can track over time, and they're good early indicators, which should in turn lead to this middle blue chart where we're looking at qualities of the leadership and team. If we get improvement in the processes, will we see the percentage of incumbents in key roles with 90% plus of required competencies? Will we see leadership roles with successors identified? And these are metrics that one can track over time and draw the correlation from the first to the second, and then inextricably to the third. And this is the kind of work we do with people, but it also gives you a sense of there are studies looking at a lot of these variables and trying to show correlations between them. So again, I want to just pause for half a second here. Are we any questions we should take, or can we move on because we're a little bit behind?
Yeah, we're a little behind on time, so I think since Q&A is coming up soon, we can...
Okay, great, thanks. So let me turn the reins over to Rich for a second, and let's talk a little bit about what's been going on at Harlem RBI.
Thanks, James. This is great to listen to for me personally. Reminds us of a lot of the reasons we've gotten into this. Harlem RBI is a 21-year-old nonprofit that has spent virtually all of its existence in a single community, and really sort of over the last 10 years growing significantly, but growing organically to meet the needs of its youth population. But over the last 2 or 3 years, a couple of important things have happened that relate to the talent issue. The first is the rate of growth for our core program has started to speed up, so that we've essentially gone from an organization with, say, 20 full-time service providers to 50 in the last couple of years. Additionally, we opened a charter school, which is literally like doubled the size of the organization in a 3 to 4 year period as well. That school started with just 2 grades, but it adds a single grade every year. And on top of that, about a year ago, we completed the organization's most recent strategic plan, which called for the first time for scaling into new communities, both in New York and nationally. And if we accomplish what we aim to over the next 5 years or so, we're looking at going from an organization of about 100 full-time employees to one that might have as many as 250 to 300. That's pretty ambitious, high-growth stuff. And to us, all of it is going to be on the back of having the right people to drive it. And I think our assurity about that, or belief in that, and therefore our willingness to invest in human capital management really comes from the challenges we've had scaling just in a single community, i.e. going over a 4-year period from 25 employees to a 5-year period from 25 to 100 employees, and having real challenges along the way. And the examples of that go up and down the organization, from a 2-year period where we had what we were calling the CFO of the Month Club, where we had three chief financial officers in about a 30 to 36 month period, to real challenges with middle managers as the organization was growing, and doing a lot of promoting line staff to middle management jobs on the basis of being very strong service providers, but with no history or necessarily evidence that they would be great managers. And additionally, just sort of weakness in terms of the processes of bringing people into the organization, so that some key roles or some roles that were less than key would stay open for a month, 2 months, 3 months, longer than that. I remember years ago we would have these social work jobs which we wanted to fill, and they're complicated jobs to fill, but they would typically they would be open for 6 months. So if you think about the impact of that programmatically, it's pretty daunting stuff. So it was very clear to us that we didn't know enough about finding the right people, and we had to get better at it. The most significant thing we did, and we didn't actually see this coming out of our strategic plan, was that we had originally in our strategic plan envisioned that, okay, we're going to make a big investment in human resources. But the deeper we got into this, and quite frankly, this happened mostly when we met AchieveMission, was that we decided to split human resources and human capital management, or what we call talent development, into 2 different departments. HR became a very important but largely administrative function in the organization. Essentially, sort of stage 1 was covered by HR. And everything on up, getting to stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 in the terms of the context of the webinar today, was the job of talent management, which is really a strategic level function in the organization. The Director of Talent Development reports directly to me and works side by side with the Chief Operating Officer, and is really seen as key a function as any other that we perform in the organization. The other piece I want to speak to is where before, HR was something that the HR department did, even though that there is now a human capital management function formalized at Harlem RBI. It is really the expectation that this is everyone in the organization's work. Everyone is a recruiter, and everyone helps to onboard. It is everybody's job to figure out how to make people better at what they do, how to call people out doing their job as well. This isn't just something that is segregated in a corner of the organization, but has to live across everybody who works at Harlem RBI. And that's a very new way of thinking about our work, but I think one that we've already seen some big payoffs. And to the point of where and how we've invested, you've seen a lot of these titles in the previous slides, but there's been heavy-duty work on building competencies, both leadership and core competencies for staff, much better hiring practices, aligned and cascaded goals for all employees, focused on a box score and a 9 box, which is something I spent 4 hours doing yesterday with my leadership team, which was essentially putting every staff member in the organization on an axis of high performing and high potential, and starting to work on figuring out what their personal development plans needed to be. To diversity, to thinking about organizational structure, not just 3 months from now, but 3 years and 5 years from now too. It's been a huge amount of work and a huge investment, but one that we're really, really excited about. And while I think we're kind of in the nascent stages of figuring out the ROI of this, I think I'll have much more to say about what at least the ROI that I can put on slides that look as good as the one James is sharing is what I can tell you is this, is that we've hired 27 people in the last 4 months. Some of those are new employees, new roles. Some of them are replacing people that we've been able to move out of the organization who we've seen as low performers. And some were filling roles that just weren't getting closed because we didn't have people in place to do the work. On a day-to-day basis, employees talk about much greater clarity of their work and their goals, not simply for themselves, but the clarity as relates to our organization's overall mission, so you don't see anybody kicking a soccer ball on the baseball field, so to speak. People understand what they're supposed to be doing every day, and their managers understand how to coach them and manage them towards those goals. And, longer term, we'll start looking at, and we are looking at, the types of things that James was just talking about. What are the vacancy rates looking like? How long do we retain people? What is staff satisfaction looking like within the organization, which we think matters a lot. And the last one I'll point to, which we're spending a lot of time thinking about, is one that did make it on a previous slide, is this idea of A players and A roles. We think some roles, all roles are important in the organization, some are more important than others. We've worked hard at identifying the ones we think are A roles, and we've worked hard at making sure that we have A players in each of those A roles. And if we don't, we've got to have a plan to get someone who's a B to an A, or we've got to have a plan to replace someone who's a B with an A, or it's really going to hold our work back and ultimately hinder us in how we get our work done and how we get our mission done.
Thanks, Rich. That was great. Great story. I'm really excited to see those early wins and looking forward to seeing some of the longer-term indicators over time. Harini, any questions? Or actually, maybe we just open up Q&A now, and if there are particular questions to Rich, you can share them to him or to the panel as you see fit.
Okay. I think there's a general question about how can small-scale nonprofits make the best and most cost-effective investment in HCM? It seems like the examples that we've given are large teams and they have the budget for this. So where can small nonprofits start?
That's a great question, and not surprisingly, we get that question a lot. So I would point to a couple different resources generally. So one is that, excuse me, as part of our mission, as part of the work funding that we're getting, we are making as many of the best practices tools available as we can. We're going to be starting that process starting next month on our website, which will be relaunching and producing a whole series of materials. And that'll go on, well, it'll keep going. So I would really encourage people either go to the site next month or email us now so we can keep you up to date as we keep doing this. And we're going to continue to do these webinars, all of which will provide more best practices for folks. I think the other resource I would look at is if you happen to be lucky enough to be in a city where the Taproot Foundation is, my prior job and the prior jobs of a lot of the people that started this organization were Taproot, and we set up a pretty good human capital management practice at Taproot that was focused at that more administrative level that's more appropriate for smaller nonprofits. So there are services available there that I think are really good. And the third piece of advice I would give people is get an HR person on your board. The truth is, if you can get a really solid HR person on your board, if you're relatively small, the challenges are relatively small, that person should be able to just grab resources and make a couple of suggestions and get a lot of the work done pretty easily for you.
Hey, James, this is Christa. I have one other suggestion.
Yeah.
At Build, I mean, we're not that big. We're still under 50 employees. 2 years ago, we were at 30. But I feel like at the time in which we made the investment, similar to Rich, in having a talent officer or really splitting out human capital, just that investment alone allowed us to take a lot of these resources that James is talking about and put them into practice. And really maximize what we got out of the talent initiative. In the absence of that, there were just too many people wearing too many hats to really get the traction we wanted to. And so by really making that investment of that human being and really being able to do that, we could leverage a lot more of the senior management's team in this work.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Christa. We certainly see a lot of people saying, well, we don't have the money to do this, but if you're an organization of 20, 30, 40 people, the chances are you do have the money, you just don't realize it. And what you need to do is figure out how do I make this, how do I reallocate resources? Because over the next year or two, and in most cases 12 months, you're going to recoup all of the investment that you make in savings in the organization. Other questions? Harini?
There's a question for Rich. From a CEO's point of view, how have you benefited from making investments in HCM? How does it make you more effective as a leader? How does it make your job easier?
Rich, I think you may be on mute. Rich, we still have you there?
Maybe Rich was done, so he left.
No. So let me try to answer that question, and I'll be curious, Christa, if you have a response. What I've seen from CEOs, typically what they've told us, at least, is that having a stronger team has allowed them to go home at night and go to sleep better. If you have a great team around you, less crises flow uphill, and you feel less burdened by the fact that you have a million details to worry about because you have great people around you that are making this stuff happen. And I know that Rich, in one of my previous discussions with him, talked about a second piece, which is he, for the first time as his organization has grown, really has now had a much better sense of the capabilities of his middle management that previously was a little bit too distant from him to get a really solid understanding of what they were capable. And it just made him proud. I mean, I think he just looks at his team and is just kind of much more amazed at what the team is capable of and more excited to come to work and work with folks. And I hear that quite a bit. And if Rich is back on the line, he'll probably tell me that I'm full of it, but hopefully not. Christa?
And the way I would describe it is I think when you're a small organization without the right talent in the right places, you're kind of like a bad volleyball team where everyone goes to the ball. I think in a sense now that we have people that are able to do their work in an effective way that is respected by their colleagues, then we each play to our strengths, and the CEO can really focus in on the things that they do best and get more traction. Our CEO has been able to focus in on more national funders and creating more of a national presence for Build in the community, and to be able to fly to Boston and set up the advisory board because she knows that things back in the Bay Area are going just fine.
Yeah, that's all great. Thanks, Christa. So let me just try to close things out pretty quickly. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to not talk to AchieveMission. I think that today's presentation gives you a little bit of a sense of what we do. And let me just say thank you. Thank you for being here. If you're here on this call, it's pretty likely that you're part of what I consider the vanguard of a movement that's going to see human capital management practices just become a much more prevalent and accepted common part of best practices in the nonprofit sector and something that funders increasingly look at. So thanks for being part of that movement. Thanks for being a leader in my mind. And I guess the second thing is if you are a professional, a talent director working on these issues, please get in touch with us. We want to grow this community. There's a small number of people that have deep expertise in this area. If you're one of them or you aspire to be one of them, we want to include you in the conversation and help each of us learn from each other. Third point is, if you want to see this webinar, or you want to share it with somebody else, if you want the deck, all of those, all the slides, all that's going to be available on our website. But in the short run, feel free to email Harini, who you've heard speak, and pose questions to us. She will both register you on our site and make sure that you get access to the webinar, the PowerPoints, and we'll just keep you apprised as we offer more webinars and more free content on our website over time. Just before I wrap up, just again thank Blue Avocado. I want to thank Ann and the Nonprofit Insurance Alliance Group. I want to thank Rich and Christa for their great contributions today. Thank Kresge and Annie Casey for their support. And with that, I guess I'm going to try to bring this webinar to its end. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, James. Thank you, everybody.